On August 23, 1895, at Miller's Photography Studio in Boston, Massachusetts, a 9-year-old girl named Eleanor Hayes stood for a portrait. She wore a dark dress with a white collar, her hair neatly braided, and she held a large black umbrella, not open, but resting against her shoulder like a walking stick. The photographer, James Miller, noted in his ledger, "Portrait of Miss Eleanor Hayes, paid by St. Catherine's Home for Children. Destination, Western Placement Program." For 124 years, this photograph sat in the archives of the Boston Children's Services, one of thousands of orphan portraits taken before children were sent west on orphan trains, a practice that relocated over 200,000 children between 1854 and 1929. The photograph seemed unremarkable. A serious child, formally dressed, holding an umbrella. But in 2019, when digital conservator Dr. Lisa Chen examined the photograph at 14,000% magnification, she discovered something hidden in plain sight. Something carved into the umbrella's handle that transformed this image from a simple orphan portrait into a heartbreaking story of loss, love, and a father's final gift. Subscribe now, because this is the story of what a child holds on to when everything else is taken away. Eleanor Hayes arrived at St. Catherine's Home for Children on July 15, 1895. She was 9 years old, thin, quiet, and holding a black umbrella that was too large for her small frame. The intake records preserved in the Boston Children's Services archives noted, Eleanor Marie Hayes, age 9 years, 4 months. Father, William Hayes, deceased June 30, 1895. Industrial accident, lumber mill. Mother, Catherine Hayes, deceased January 12, 1891, tuberculosis. No living relatives willing to provide care. Possessions upon arrival. 1 dress, worn. 1 pair of shoes, poor condition. 1 umbrella, good condition. Appears to be adult male's umbrella. Child extremely attached to umbrella. Matron notes. Child refuses to relinquish umbrella even for sleeping. Recommend allowing possession as comfort item. Industrial accidents were common in 1895 Boston. William Hayes had worked at the Sawyer Lumber Mill in South Boston, operating a circular saw. On June 30, 1895, a belt snapped on the machinery, causing the saw to kick back. William was killed instantly. He was 34 years old. He left behind Eleanor, who had already lost her mother 4 years earlier to tuberculosis, the disease that killed 1 in 7 people in the late 19th century. After Catherine's death in 1891, William had raised Eleanor alone. He'd worked 12-hour days at the mill, 6 days a week, earning $14 a week. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rent a small apartment, keep Eleanor fed and clothed, and send her to school through 3rd grade. William's sister, Margaret, had helped when she could, checking on Eleanor after school, bringing meals occasionally. But Margaret had 6 children of her own and a husband who drank. She couldn't take in another child when William died. The city of Boston had a solution: St. Catherine's Home for Children, a Catholic orphanage that housed approximately 200 children at any given time. The orphanage was clean, well-run, and provided basic education. But it wasn't a permanent home. It was a way station. Children who came to St. Catherine's typically stayed for 2 to 6 weeks before being placed on orphan trains, trains that carried orphaned and homeless children from East Coast cities to rural communities in the Midwest and West, where they would be placed with farming families who needed extra labor. The system was presented as humanitarian, giving children homes and opportunities they wouldn't have had in crowded cities. But in reality, many children became unpaid farm laborers, domestic servants, or worse. Eleanor was scheduled for the orphan train departing Boston on August 26, 1895, just 3 days after her photograph was taken. Standard procedure required that each child be photographed before departure. The photographs served multiple purposes. They were sent ahead to potential placement families. They were kept in orphanage records for identification, and they were sometimes given to the children themselves as the only memento of their former lives. James Miller, the contract photographer for St. Catherine's, had photographed hundreds of orphans over the years. Most children arrived at his studio with nothing: no toys, no keepsakes, no possessions beyond the clothes they wore. But Eleanor arrived with her umbrella. The matron who accompanied her to the photography studio explained, "It was her father's. She won't let it go. We've tried, but she becomes hysterical." The Mother Superior said to let her keep it for the photograph. "She'll have to leave it behind when she boards the train. Children are only allowed one small bag. But for now, let her hold it." James positioned Eleanor in front of his standard backdrop. "Hold the umbrella against your shoulder, like this," he instructed, demonstrating. "And look at the camera. Try to look pleasant, dear. This photograph might be the first thing your new family sees." Eleanor did as she was told, but she didn't look pleasant. She looked terrified. The August 23rd, 1895 photography session at Miller's studio lasted approximately 15 minutes. James Miller's ledger showed that St. Catherine's had sent 12 children that day for portraits, all scheduled for the August 26th orphan train. Eleanor was the 7th child photographed. The standard fee was 25 cents per child, paid by the orphanage. Each child received a simple portrait, standing or seated, hands visible, face clearly shown, formal attire. No props were typically allowed. The orphanage wanted the children to look presentable but not privileged. But Eleanor's umbrella was an exception. "She wouldn't put it down," James wrote in his notes. The matron said it belonged to her deceased father and was the only possession she had from her former life. "I positioned her holding it against her shoulder, standing, formal pose. The child appeared deeply unhappy but compliant. Exposure time, 12 seconds. One plate only. Orphanage policy doesn't allow for multiple attempts." 12 seconds was a long time for a 9-year-old to remain completely still. Any movement would result in blur. Eleanor stood frozen, holding the umbrella, staring at the camera with an expression that James later described as profound resignation. After the photograph was taken, the matron who'd accompanied Eleanor took her hand to lead her back to the orphanage. "Can I keep it?" Eleanor asked quietly, clutching the umbrella. "Can I bring it on the train?" "No, dear," the matron said, not unkindly. "The train only allows one small bag per child. You'll have a change of clothes and a Bible. That's all. The umbrella is too large. It will have to stay at St. Catherine's." "But it was Papa's," Eleanor whispered. "It's all I have." "Your new family will provide everything you need," the matron assured her. "You'll have a home, food, clothes. You won't need an old umbrella." But Eleanor understood what the matron didn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. The umbrella wasn't about rain protection. It was about connection. It was the last physical thing her father had touched. The last object that connected her to him, to her mother, to the life she'd had before everything fell apart. The orphan train system was designed to sever those connections. Children were often given new names to help them start fresh. They were discouraged from talking about their pasts. They were told to be grateful for their new opportunities and to forget about the families they'd lost. Eleanor would board the train on August 26th with one small cloth bag containing one change of clothes, one pair of undergarments, one nightgown, one Bible, and one photograph. The portrait James Miller had just taken. The umbrella would be left behind at St. Catherine's, stored in the orphanage's property room, with dozens of other items too large or impractical for children to take with them. Toys, books, family photographs, letters, religious medals. Most of these items were never reclaimed. When children were placed with families in the West, they rarely returned to Boston. The orphanage eventually disposed of unclaimed property, selling usable items and discarding the rest. Eleanor's umbrella probably met this fate, sold for a few cents or thrown away when storage space was needed. But the photograph survived. It was filed in St. Catherine's records, then transferred to Boston Children's Services when the orphanage closed in 1947, then moved to the Massachusetts State Archives when child welfare records were consolidated in 1983. For 124 years, that photograph was simply Orphan Portrait, Girl with Umbrella, 1895, Unknown Destination. Until 2019, when someone finally looked closely enough to see what Eleanor had been holding on to. Dr. Lisa Chen began working with the Massachusetts State Archives in January 2019 as part of a digital preservation project. The goal was to scan and catalog approximately 15,000 photographs from the orphan train era, creating a searchable database that might help descendants trace their family histories. Many people whose ancestors had been orphan train riders had no photographs, no documentation, no way to visualize their family members as children. The photographs were in surprisingly good condition, Lisa explained in a 2020 interview. They'd been stored in acid-free boxes in climate-controlled archives, some fading, some minor damage, but mostly intact. My job was to scan them at high resolution, high enough that you could zoom in and see tiny details like the weave of fabric or individual strands of hair. Lisa scanned Eleanor's photograph in March 2019. At standard resolution, it showed exactly what the archive description indicated. A young girl in a dark dress, holding a large umbrella, standing in a photography studio. But Lisa's scanning protocol required examination at multiple magnification levels, 2,000%, 5,000%, 10,000%, and 14,000%, to ensure no details were lost in the digital preservation process. At 2,000%, Lisa examined Eleanor's face. The child's expression was serious, sad, resigned, typical of orphan portraits, where children rarely smiled. At 5,000%, Lisa examined the dress. Simple, dark, well-worn. The kind of dress that could be handed down from child to child in an orphanage. At 10,000%, Lisa examined the background. Standard studio backdrop, plain and professional. At 14,000%, Lisa examined the umbrella, and that's when she saw it. The umbrella's handle, where Eleanor's right hand gripped it tightly, had been carved. Not decoratively, not an ornate design meant for beauty, but deliberately. Letters, initials. Lisa adjusted the contrast and sharpness. The letters became clearer. W.H., William Hayes, Eleanor's father. But there was more. Below the initials, carved in smaller letters, was a date, 1890, and below that, a single word, Ellie. Lisa sat back from her monitor, her hands shaking slightly. This wasn't just an umbrella. This was a father's umbrella, carved with his initials, the year, presumably when he'd carved it, and his daughter's nickname. William Hayes had personalized his umbrella, and somehow, through his death, through Eleanor's placement in the orphanage, through 124 years of archival storage, that umbrella had remained with Eleanor long enough to be photographed, preserving the only evidence that William Hayes had loved his daughter enough to carve her name into his possession. Lisa immediately began researching. She found William Hayes's death certificate from the Suffolk County records, William James Hayes, age 34, died June 30th, 1895. Cause: industrial accident, saw machinery. Occupation: lumber mill worker. She found his wife's death certificate. Catherine Marie Hayes, 34, age 29, died January 12th, 1891. Cause: tuberculosis. She found Eleanor's birth certificate. Eleanor Marie Hayes, born April 15th, 1886, parents William and Catherine Hayes. She found the St. Catherine's intake records with Eleanor's arrival on July 15th, 1895. She found the orphan train manifests showing Eleanor's departure on August 26th, 1895. Destination: Kansas. Placement status: assigned to farming family, Sedgwick County. But she couldn't find what happened to Eleanor after that. The orphan train system was notoriously poor at maintaining follow-up records. Children were placed with families, sometimes legally adopted, sometimes simply kept as laborers. Many lost their original surnames. Many lost contact with their origins completely. Eleanor Hayes had vanished into history, but her photograph and her father's carved umbrella remained. As Lisa continued her research, she began to understand the significance of the carved initials and date. William Hayes had carved his umbrella handle in 1890, 1 year before his wife Catherine died of tuberculosis. This meant the carving was made while his family was still intact, while Catherine was still alive, while Eleanor was only 4 years old. The umbrella tells a story of before, Lisa realized. Before Catherine got sick, before she died, before William was left raising Eleanor alone, before the industrial accident. The umbrella is an artifact from when Eleanor's family was whole. Lisa consulted with Dr. Margaret Patterson, a historian specializing in late 19th century working-class life in Boston. Umbrellas were significant possessions for working-class families, Dr. Patterson explained. They weren't cheap. A good umbrella cost about $2, which was nearly 15% of a week's wages for a mill worker like William Hayes. A man might own one umbrella his entire adult life, repairing it when the fabric tore, replacing the handle if it broke, caring for it because he couldn't afford to replace it. Carving your initials into it was a way of marking ownership, yes, but also a way of personalizing something mass-produced. Adding Ellie, his daughter's nickname, was an act of love. He was claiming both the object and his role as father. The year 1890 was significant in other ways. In January 1891, when Catherine began showing symptoms of tuberculosis, the family's life would have started changing. Catherine would have become increasingly ill, unable to work, requiring care. William would have taken extra shifts when possible, trying to pay for medicine and doctors. By the time Catherine died in January 1891, the family's finances would have been devastated. Medical bills, funeral costs, loss of Catherine's income. She'd worked as a seamstress from home before becoming too ill. All of this would have pushed William and Eleanor toward poverty. For the next 4 years, William struggled to keep Eleanor housed, fed, and clothed while working at the lumber mill. His sister Margaret helped when she could, but her own family was barely getting by. And through all of this, William carried his umbrella, the one he'd carved in happier times, when his wife was still alive, when his daughter was small, when the future had seemed manageable. When William died in the mill accident on June 30th, 1895, his possessions were minimal. His clothes, work-worn and not worth keeping. His tools, which belonged to the mill. A few coins in his pocket, and his umbrella. Margaret, sorting through William's room after his death, gave the umbrella to Eleanor. "This was your papa's," Margaret told her. "He carried it every day. When it rained, he'd open it and say, "Ellie's umbrella is keeping us dry today. He loved you very much." Eleanor, 9 years old and newly orphaned for the second time, clutched the umbrella like a lifeline. 2 weeks later, when Margaret tearfully explained that Eleanor would have to go to St. Catherine's orphanage because Margaret couldn't afford to keep her, Eleanor packed her few belongings and jammed the umbrella. The matrons at St. Catherine's tried to take it away. "You don't need such a large item," they said. "You'll have everything you need here." But Eleanor wouldn't let go. She slept with it. She carried it everywhere. She held it with a desperation that eventually convinced the orphanage staff to let her keep it, at least until the orphan train departed. The umbrella represented everything Eleanor had lost: her mother, her father, her home, her former life. It was carved with proof that she'd been loved, that she'd belonged to someone, that she'd once had a nickname and a family who cared about her. Eleanor Hayes boarded the orphan train on August 26, 1895, from South Station in Boston. The train carried 43 children ranging in age from 3 to 14. They were headed to Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, where they would be placed out with families who had submitted applications to the Children's Aid Society. The journey would take 4 days. At each major stop along the route, children would be presented to potential families, standing on train platforms or in local churches, while adults inspected them, asked questions, and chose which children they wanted to take home. The process was called placement by the charities that organized it. The children called it the choosing, and it was terrifying. St. Catherine's records show that Eleanor carried her small cloth bag containing one change of clothes, undergarments, a nightgown, a Bible, and her photograph. The umbrella had been left behind, too large to bring, against orphan train regulations. But Eleanor had something else: a small piece of wood, approximately 2 inches long, that she'd hidden in the lining of her bag. Years later, in 1943, when Eleanor was 67 years old, she would tell her granddaughter about that piece of wood. "I couldn't bring Papa's umbrella on the train. They made me leave it at the orphanage. But the night before we left, I couldn't sleep. I was so scared. And I remembered what Papa had carved on the umbrella handle. His initials. My name. So I found a knife in the orphanage kitchen, and I cut that piece off. Just the piece with Ellie carved in it. I hid it in my bag. Nobody knew. I kept it with me for years." The orphan train stopped first in Albany, then Buffalo, then Cleveland, then Indianapolis, then St. Louis. At each stop, some children were chosen. Eleanor watched as younger children, especially babies and toddlers, were quickly selected by families who wanted malleable children they could raise properly. Older children were harder to place. Potential families worried they were set in their ways or might run away back to the city. By the time the train reached Wichita, Kansas, on August 30th, 1895, Eleanor was one of 17 children still waiting for placement. The Wichita placement event was held at the First Presbyterian Church. The remaining children stood in a line while approximately 30 farming families walked past, examining them like livestock at an auction. Eleanor was chosen by Jacob and Harriet Mueller, German immigrants who owned a wheat farm in Sedgwick County. They had no children of their own and needed help with farm work and household duties. "Can she work?" Jacob asked the placement agent, gesturing at Eleanor. "She's 9 years old, healthy, no known ailments," the agent replied. "She attended school through 3rd grade. She can read and do basic arithmetic." "Good," Jacob said. "We'll take her." That was it. No questions about Eleanor's personality, her interests, her history. No conversation with Eleanor herself. Just, "We'll take her." Eleanor left the church with the Mullers that afternoon. She never returned to Boston. She never saw her father's umbrella again. But she kept the carved piece of wood, Ellie, hidden in her possessions for the rest of her life. And 124 years later, digital magnification revealed what that piece had been carved from. Proof that William Hayes had loved his daughter, had called her by a nickname, had claimed her as his own even as the world was preparing to take her away. Dr. Lisa Chen's discovery of the carved umbrella handle prompted her to intensify her search for information about Eleanor Hayes. The orphan train system had fragmented countless family histories, but Lisa was determined to piece together Eleanor's story. She started with Sedgwick County, Kansas records. In the 1900 census, she found Eleanor Mueller, age 14, daughter, Kansas. Eleanor had been legally adopted by the Muellers and had taken their surname. In the 1910 census, Eleanor Mueller, age 24, married, Sedgwick County, Kansas. Husband, Frank Sullivan, age 26, farmer. Eleanor had married at 19, young by modern standards, but typical for rural Kansas in 1905. Frank Sullivan was an Irish immigrant who'd come to Kansas as a child himself. He and Eleanor had met at a church social. They married in October 1905 and established their own small farm. By 1920, Eleanor and Frank had 4 children: William, named after Eleanor's father; Catherine, named after Eleanor's mother; Ruth, and James. Lisa found something else in Eleanor's records. In 1918, when Eleanor registered for a World War I women's auxiliary organization, she'd listed her birth name on the form as Eleanor Hayes rather than Eleanor Mueller, suggesting she'd never forgotten her original identity, even though she'd been placed with the Muellers 33 years earlier. Lisa eventually made contact with descendants through genealogy websites. She found Jennifer Sullivan Brooks, Eleanor's great-granddaughter, living in Topeka, Kansas. "I knew my great-grandmother had been an orphan train rider," Jennifer told Lisa when they spoke by phone. "She talked about it occasionally when I was young. She said she'd come from Boston, that her parents had both died, and that she'd been sent west on a train when she was 9 years old." "Did she ever mention her father's umbrella?" Lisa asked. "Yes," Jennifer said, surprised. "She kept a small piece of carved wood in her jewelry box. She said it was from her father's umbrella, that she'd cut it off before leaving Boston because they wouldn't let her bring the umbrella on the train. She said her father had carved her nickname on it." Jennifer still had the piece of wood. When Lisa asked if she could see it, Jennifer sent photographs. The piece was approximately 2 inches long, dark with age, worn smooth from decades of handling. And carved into its surface, barely visible but still there, was the word Ellie. Lisa compared the carving style and lettering to the initials visible on the umbrella handle in Eleanor's photograph. They matched perfectly. Eleanor Hayes Sullivan had carried that piece of wood from Boston to Kansas in 1895, had kept it through her adoption, her marriage, her motherhood, her entire life. When she died in 1968 at age 82, she'd passed it to her daughter Catherine, who'd passed it to her daughter Ruth, who'd passed it to Jennifer. "Great-grandmother always said it was the only thing she had from her real family," Jennifer explained. "She loved the Muellers. They treated her well, gave her an education, raised her as their daughter. But she never forgot where she came from. And she never forgot that her father had loved her enough to carve her name into his umbrella." In November 2019, the Massachusetts Historical Society organized an exhibition, Orphan Train Memories, Lost Children, Found Stories. Eleanor's photograph was displayed prominently, with the carved umbrella handle digitally magnified and explained. Beside the photograph, the museum displayed Jennifer's piece of carved wood, on loan, and Eleanor's story. Eleanor Hayes, orphaned at age 9, photographed holding her father's umbrella before being sent west on an orphan train. The umbrella, carved with her father's initials and her nickname, was the last connection to her family. She was forced to leave it behind, but secretly cut off the piece bearing her name. She kept it for 73 years, preserving the only physical proof that she'd once been Ellie, a beloved daughter, not just an orphan. The exhibition was visited by over 40,000 people in 6 months. Many were descendants of orphan train riders. Many cried reading Eleanor's story. Jennifer Sullivan Brooks gave a speech at the exhibition opening. "My great-grandmother lived to be 82 years old. She had a good life, a loving husband, 4 children, grandchildren, a home. But she never forgot the terror of being 9 years old, alone, holding her father's umbrella in a photography studio, knowing she was about to lose the last thing connecting her to her family." That umbrella wasn't just an object. It was proof. Proof that William Hayes had existed. Proof that he'd loved his daughter. Proof that Eleanor had once belonged to someone. And when they tried to take that away from her, she refused. She cut off a piece and carried it with her for the rest of her life. Today, we honor her courage. We honor her father's love. And we remember the 200,000 children like Eleanor who were sent west on orphan trains. Children who lost their families, their names, their histories. Many of their stories will never be recovered. But Eleanor's story survives. Because of a photograph. Because of a carved umbrella handle. Because she refused to let go. Eleanor Hayes Sullivan died on March 14, 1968, in Topeka, Kansas. She was buried next to her husband Frank in Mount Hope Cemetery. Her headstone reads, Eleanor Hayes Sullivan, 1886 to 1968. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, Ellie. The carved piece of wood is now permanently displayed at the Massachusetts Historical Society next to Eleanor's photograph, and millions of people have now seen what Eleanor clutched so desperately in 1895. Her father's umbrella, carved with love, held with hope, photographed for posterity. Sometimes the saddest stories are the ones where love survives, even when everything else is lost. Eleanor's photograph and the carved wood piece are on display at the Massachusetts Historical Society, Boston. Learn more about orphan train history and help descendants find their family stories. Subscribe for more forgotten histories revealed through photography.